Good morning. We are reviewing and summarizing the conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis, and we are on page 1372. So this summary has essentially began from more or less page 1350 with a little review of a bit earlier as well. And the goal here is to conclude, the Hemshech concludes on page 1477, yeah. And just to remind everyone, and those who may be listening to this for the first time, we've already learned the Hemshech Ayin Beis till the conclusion. But being that the Rebbe Rashab never ended the Hemshech, as we can see from the fact that there are many questions, several questions, I should say, that he didn't answer, and several themes that he didn't conclude. So we went back to find the source material, which is namely a mimer called Mikta Hashem Elokeinu Magbil L'Sheves Amashpili Liris B'Shemayim Ba'aretz, a Chanukah mimer from the Alter Rebbe and Torah Ohr Chanukah mimer, and elaborated upon by the Mittler Rebbe. And we learned both of those Amoraim in depth inside for several months, and with that, as well as some other texts that we reviewed. And then, armed with that, we're going to return now to Ayin Beis, informed by that, to be able to try to understand the general context in a broader sense, as well as how the Rebbe Rashab would have most likely concluded or continued the Hemshech, because it's directly taken from those Amoraim, which is very obvious. So this time around, we're still learning quite a few details, but I'm focusing mostly on not getting distracted by the actual text and the line by line, because we did that already. We learned that the first time around, which was almost 2 years ago, actually. But this time to study it in context of the bigger flow of the Hemshech of Ayin Beis' central theme, but especially the part that we're in right now, which I said we have to take many pieces, moving parts here that have to be organized. First of all, understanding the Rebbe Rashab himself is quite dense and quite many different themes overlapping. But now that we have also the other Amoraim, the source material, especially the Amoraim Magbil L'Sheves, as I said, then we could understand how this is ultimately going to continue on. So I've done this a number of times throughout our learning, going back to the central themes. So I'm not going to do it every day, obviously, but I will do certain key points just to keep us in focus. So the theme of Ayin Beis is the interface between God and existence, essentially a blueprint for us to connect to God. When they're so antithetical. One is a creator, one is the creation. So many ways we are unlike God. And yet Hashem God wanted us to make a dir b'tachtenim, a home for Him in this world, for God. Not for us, for Him, for God. Or in the language of the Pasuk, v'aseh l'migdash v'shachanti b'seicham, build for me a temple and I will dwell among you. But in the broader sense, that means among you and among this entire world. So that requires an intricate, detailed method and strategy how to do that. So in general, that's what Torah and mitzvahs are given to us for, to take God's Torah and mitzvahs and transform this world and align it with God's will. But obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, because we have to deal with the fact that we are mortals and we have our own challenges and our own self-interest and our own animal soul and all that comes with that, as we see a world that is not exactly aligned with godliness. So there's a real battle going on. And therefore, Torah in general, and Chassidus particular, and Chassidus Chabad, and Ayin Beis, which captures so much of Chassidus Chabad, because that's what the Rebbe Rashab does. He draws together all the Amoraim, so many of the themes. I would say all of the themes, somewhere in Ayin Beis is touched upon, sometimes more at length than others, and to explain the process of firstly how God created existence, in a very organized step-by-step process that we can understand and relate to, similar to how you would build a building, similar to how you'd write a book, similar to how you'd compose music or create art, as well as a process of tools for us to climb the ladder and retrace the steps and reconnect. And in general, this integration is both considered mamata l'mayla and mamayla l'mata. Mamata l'mayla means it starts from us, we initiate. That's primarily through prayer, through tefillah, or God initiating essentially by giving us Torah, which is a gift from above that gives us a blueprint and helps us. That's mamayla l'mata. But they overlap and they interact and they're both necessary as we learned at length. So if you want to define the structure of Ayin Beis, you can say in the beginning of, well, I would say in the first third of the book of volume 2 of Ayin Beis, in the edition I'm using, he begins to talk about, I would say actually the end of volume 1, talks about mamayla l'mata, mamata l'mayla. In the verse that we say every day in Ashrei, Arimimcha l'kai hamelech, which can be interpreted both mamata l'mayla and mamayla l'mata. Arimimcha referring to the transcendent, Reimamus, Keser, Elekai hamelech referring to Elikim and Malchus, which is the divine mamala kalam and immanent energy, a divine that manifests within existence. And Arimimcha, either Arimimcha, you're elevating Elekai hamelech, that's mamata l'mayla, or you're drawing down Arimimcha into Elekai hamelech, which is mamayla l'mata. And then in volume 2 is where he really starts going into detail and discusses the need for both of them, tefillah and Torah, and then begins the big beer, the long explanation in the Torah of the Magid, aseh l'chashtei chatzetzes, to make 2 trumpets. Chatzetzes comes from the word chatzitzuris. Chatzitzura means half an image, essentially the story of the interface, that we are half the image, the neshama as it comes down below, the divine is the other half, and we need to join together to create one divine image, a human being aligned with the divine image in which we were created. And he discusses that at length in detail. That goes for over 550 pages and concludes in volume 3 on page 1349 to be exact. That's where he concludes mamata l'mayla. And then he says on page 1350, if you go to the line, which I've referred to many times, the top of the line, which is essentially where we are now middle. So one key thing to keep in mind is that we're still talking interface, there's still mamata l'mayla, mamayla l'mata, but now, after a long discussion of primarily Yadaita Yein v'shavesa levavecha ke'avayu alekim b'shamayim mal v'aretz mitachas einoid, which he explained was mamata l'mayla, in contrast to ata haresa ladas, which is an expression, you have revealed yourself, which is mamayla l'mata, and we've discussed also at length. So now the primary thing is understanding the second aspect of this interface, and that is the mamayla l'mata connection. But again, it goes hand in hand with the mamata l'mayla, and they overlap all the time, as we've been learning and we shall be learning. So that's a central point. Now, the specifics begins by discussing the difference between, discussing the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, and in contrasting that to Ner Mitzvah v'Teira Er. So firstly, Neshama is compared to a candle, a Mitzvah is compared to a candle, and Teira is compared to light. So he begins to explain that. That's where the Hamekbir L'Shav is the mimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe come into play. The Rebbe Rashab refers to it explicitly on page 1352. And he explains it briefly, well, I'd say 2-3 pages around that. And then the Rebbe Rashab goes into Eir HaRiyah. Says to explain that, let's talk about Eir HaRiyah, vision. And that brings us into Eir Makabel, the Eir that was the recipient, in contrast to Eir Mashpia, the giver, and 3 different levels in Eir Makabel. One of them is the example is the vision and eyesight, Riyah. The other 2 is the moonlight and a luminous glowing stone. And then explains that these 3, the distinctions between them all 3 levels in Malchus, because Malchus is the Eir Makabel in contrast to Zah, which is the Eir Mashpia, Zah, Zer, Ampin, the Midas. And then begins to understand that, let us understand in Torah the structure of Mikra, Mishna, Talmud. This began on the bottom of page 1364. This is just a flow of where we are right now. And we're in the middle of that Mikra, Mishna, Talmud now, which is going to come back to explain the three levels of Er Makabel, which in turn will bring us back to Er Riyah, which in turn will bring us back to Torah Er, in contrast to Ner Mitzvah and Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom. But we're not up to that yet. We haven't returned yet. That will then take us all the way to the end of the Hemshech. And the end, of course, does not get back to Ner Mitzvah, doesn't even get back to the conclusion of Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, to be honest. So we'll talk about that as we go further when we get there. But right now, the discussion is around Torah, the three dimensions, if you wish, three levels or three tiers of Torah, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud. So briefly, let's put that into general context. So as I explained a few days ago in a longer introduction, Torah, right? Torah illuminates us and gives us a guiding light of how to understand what God wants of us, what the plan is, essentially the blueprint for life. I call it life's operator's manual. But it's more than just that, because it's also an interactive process that we don't just listen to Torah, we also study Torah, and we understand it. And we are part of the development of Torah. What I mean by that is not that we can, God forbid, create a mitzvah, but the understanding of Torah and break it down into details. And because Torah is given in a seichelic way, it's a logical constitution, so to speak. There's a legal system involved with logic and with rules. And we were given these rules to process, study them, but also figure out if there's and discuss and argue and counter-argue to be able to clarify different points. So the Torah is essentially not just a book given to us and just follow orders and everything. The Torah is also a book that is part of, I wouldn't even use the word book, as I said, blueprint, but it's also, we're part of studying it and internalizing it and integrating it. So Torah is the perfect example of an interface. That's what an interface is. We live our lives. Initially, we don't know what direction to take. Think of it like the dark world, and the roads are all dark. Kol drachim b'cheskes sakona. All the paths are dangerous, meaning it's dark paths. It comes to Torah. Think of it like cosmic headlights or cosmic lighthouse that shines a light that tells us what roads to travel on, what roads not to travel on, and all the details that Torah Mitzvahs lays out for us. But being that this is the kavanah is that it should be internalized, that it should become ours and we should own it and completely make it ours, adir b'tachteinim. So therefore, the Torah is not just given on a platter, you're given the basics. And those basics are then given to us to learn and understand until we are able to really implement the fullest sense of the word. So in that context, Torah itself has different dimensions. So I'm going to put it in my own language to make it a little more practical, because as I said, when we learn inside here, it can be a little dense and some of the language is somewhat abstract, Kabbalistic and so on. So briefly, Nikra Mishnah, and now we've started learning Talmud, so we'll get to Talmud last here. The Mikra is essentially the closest thing in words to what the divine wants. It's purely divine. However, because Torah is not in heaven, the Torah is given to us to be able to read. So we have Mikra. We have verses that we can teach ourselves, our children, from youngest of age. So Mikra, if you think of it, it's as closest to the closest. When I say to the divine, I don't mean close to the divine without words, because it does have letters, Asius. But that's why Mikra is not something that you're going to be able to sit and study. It's not a philosophical book. It's not a historical book. Not a book like a usual book that you read and gives you insights. If you want to, for example, understand how to do heart surgery, you're not going to open up a Torah for that. Nor are you going to open it up how to repair your automobile. I don't mean it to be mundane. I just mean to say it's not a technical manual like that. Torah is a godly book. It's a divine book. And as he said clearly, he says, when you could tell that there's something very divine about it. So it does have a certain logic to it, and it talks about creation, and it talks about, but bottom line is it's divine language, essentially, with a minimal exposure to our seichel. So Mikra is so-called the purest form of the divine as it manifests in Torah. So Hashem gave us the Mikra Torah Shebiksav, He gave it to Moshe Rabbeinu. What's lacking in Mikra is that we don't have details, and we don't have explanation. So if you want a Torah to be internalized, Mikra is very hard to internalize. Yes, it's very good. Mikra is excellent to have a divine epiphany and a divine experience, because it's purely elokus, like we learned. But for the able to internalize and say, well, okay, you're telling me keep Shabbos. How do you keep Shabbos? What exactly am I supposed to do? What am I not supposed to do? So in the Mikra, you'll find certain things, but like he said, it's either in story form, which everything is in story form, or it's just the actual mitzvahs without any details and without any explanations. So comes the second part, Mishna, they'll say, is already the divine that's being manifest in Seichel, in Havana V'Asaga. Because Mishna takes a pasuk and tells us the details and breaks it down into halachas. Halachas, and Mishna is Torah b'Pirusha. The Torah was given together with Torah Shebal Peh. So it's also divine, like we all said, Torah Achas, but it's now a divine that is subject to explanation, to discussion. And that's exactly the kavanah. That's how Hashem wanted it to be. The written Torah was more like the key points, so to speak. I don't want to call it bullet points because I don't want to be in any way disrespectful, I guess is the right word. But the word is that it's like bullet points, and Torah Shebal Peh explains it in detail. Okay. So now, with that, that's Mishnah. Now, the thing is, remember, we're dealing with a world that is not receptive and not necessarily understanding Torah. So in other words, we need to acclimate ourselves to all of this. So what do you deal with someone who's not able to fully understand the Mishnah? So then you have the Braisa, he explained, when Golus started becoming a factor, where the Elokus became more concealed due to the generational changes and due to the events that happened, the sins of human beings and so on. So Braisa serves the role of being, you can say, somewhat of carrying Mishnah into a world where what he called the Islapshus of Malchus and the Ayin Sorim of Biyah, which is already a state of concealment. So Braisa needs more explanation. The light is not as intense and powerful as in Mishnah. However, it does bring it down to the next level where even when the Kalim are not so developed, in other words, like a let's say more like a beginner student, so Braisa brings the power of Mishnah into that level as well. That's why it's called Braisa Bar Chutz, outside of the realm of Gedusha, as we discussed and explained, especially on page 1372, and before that primarily that page. So briefly, Braisa in this context goes together with Mishnah, because this comes from the same teachers, the Tanoim, but in that level itself, it's like a second level. So far, Mikra and Mishnah, if you were to distinguish between the two, one is much more of an Atzmi, Mikra, with little Giluyim. The other is more Giluyim. Bring Giluyim and bring the Giluyim even into a darker place. Now, what is lacking, what is still missing here, of course, is what happens next. The fact of the matter is we, meaning not just our generation, after the destruction of the temple, the Helen became more intense. So that's where we enter into the world of Talmud. Talmud, as we're going to learn in more detail, is the process of human beings using their minds to try to understand what the Mishnah says. So people who are like the Tanoim, for them, the light was radiating. In a way, it was a much more Mamayla Lamata approach to learning Torah. It wasn't completely Mamayla Lamata because they did have to learn it, and they did have to understand it, and they did discuss it, and they even have different opinions, but it's still, as we shall soon see, is primarily a time of light. Talmud is the opposite, is a time of darkness. And the darkness is trying to figure out what does it say in Mishnah, which in turn is explaining what it says in Mikra. So at the end of the day, what we're going to end up learning, and I'm just giving a little preview of where we're going, is that Talmud in direct contrast to Mikra, is in Torah itself the most Momata Lamayla. Because here we're talking about trying to understand something that is not clear. In Mikra, for sure, it's not clear. Mishna, even Mishna. But through the process of our exertion and effort and struggle in learning Torah, we will come to understand deepest levels of the divine will and the divine plan and the divine wisdom, even more than in Mishnah and even more than in Mikra, in Gilui. Bottom line is, Talmud will ultimately reveal the etzem of Mikra, and of course the etzem of Mishnah as well. So if you talked in the world of Giluyim, Mishnah is more begilui than Mikra. In the world of etzem, Mikra is higher than all of them. Talmud is going to do, ironically or paradoxically, I should say, Talmud is going to go lower than all of them because it's going through darkness, but through the darkness it's going to lead us to a clarity of being Megala, the etzem of the Mikra, that was not even as Gala in Mishnah. That's what ultimately we're going to learn. And therefore we're going to have the best of all worlds at the end of the day. We're going to have the etzem of Mikra, which, as I said, is most purely divine. We're going to have the Giluyim of Mishnah, but we'll now understand it on our terms, even in our darkest situations where we don't have clarity, we will find that clarity. But here is going to be required not just the learning of Torah, but our effort. That's a key here, our effort. So in a sense, Mishnah does not have as much human effort as Talmud does. But on the other hand, Talmud is much darker state because it's coming in a state of darkness, and Mishnah is coming in a state of Gilui. So this is the classic picture of all three. Then they come together. We'll understand three levels of Er Makabel, and ultimately in interfacing our existence with the divine. And all three are critical in this process. And then he's going to go back to explain how it corresponds to the moonlight, to the luminous stone, and to the eyesight. Eyesight is not exactly spelled out, but I'll spell it out when we get there. And ultimately the goal is that even in a world of darkness, where we don't have Torah clarity, through our exertion and efforts in learning Torah, obviously Mikra, Mishnah, and primarily through Talmud, we come to a total clarity that our entire beings, not just the time of revelation, but even in the time of Golus, our entire beings become saturated, become permeated with the divine plan, that we can align ourselves, and we become aligned to godliness. And ultimately, that's where we were able to have the Eir Hariyah, not just to experience godliness through listening and through learning, but to actually see and perceive godliness just like you see with your own eyes, that our very eyes will not need an outside light. We will be able to be so infused with the divine that our very beings will exude and express the divine will and the divine wisdom. So today, we don't have that level of integration, but the process of Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud helps us get to that point. And of course, the Asad Lave, we will have that. And then we'll have it on all levels. You'll have the Etzem, Begili, in a way that permeates even the lowest levels, even the darkest states of being. So that's what we are in the middle of learning, and we'll learn it inside. As I said, if I see something that's too distracting or not, I don't want to say tangential, but too much detail, I rely on what we learned the first time. I'll keep the flow mostly to focus on the central themes that we just discussed as we go along. But a lot of this is very relevant because it's directly connected to this theme. So that brings us back to where we are now. So what have we learned so far? We learned about Mishnah and Mikra, Mishnah, and Braisa. I already explained. On page 1372, which is where we're up to the end of the paragraph, the last thing we learned was, what is Talmud in contrast to Mishnah? So he said, Talmud, Mishnah, we said, is in the world of Yetzirah, Pri Eitz Chaim says. Mikra is in the world of Asiyah. And the reason being, because Mikra is being the highest level, higher than Giluyim, its only form of expression is in Asiyah, in action, without many details in Giluyim. Mishnah, on the other hand, is Chagas itself, and that could be revealed, and therefore is revealed in Yetzirah, which is the world of Midas, and Midas is a revelation that relates to existence. And so the root of Mikra is in Chabad of Atzilus, higher than, like I said, Atzmi, higher than Giluyim. And that's why it expresses itself in the lowest place in Asiyah. That's how it expresses itself. Mishna is rooted in Chagas of Atzilus, and therefore expresses itself in the Chagas, in the Midas of Yetzirah, the Vov Ksovis of Yetzirah, and general Yetzirah. Talmud is rooted in the Hi of Atzilus, because on one hand, the lowest level. But where's it manifest? In Bria. And here's where we have to understand that Bria, even though it's higher than Yetzirah and Asiyah, and you think, okay, there's more Gilui in it, the truth is, Bria is a world that's defined by Cheshach. But not the Cheshach of Asiyah, where Asiyah is just a minimal revelation. Here the Cheshach is because it's higher than he says, Beira Cheshach, as he explains, he says it's really L'mayla B'chinas Etzem Ha'erim Yetzirah, which we're going to learn later is what we arrive at. But its expression is in the status, so it's a darkness that precedes Gilui. That's what he said here. The Mailam B'chinas Etzem Ha'erim Yetzirah, Nak M'sheh. But so on one hand, it's in the world of Bria, but it's only a reflection. Whereas in Yetzirah, you get much more of the Gilui itself. In Bria, you only get a reflection. Like he gave the example of Koy and Zeh, that sometimes a higher level, we only see the outer reflection of it. A lower level, we see the very experience itself. So that's where Bria is. But to understand this, we have to obviously understand the process of Talmud. Because on one hand, Talmud is definitely lower than Mishnah. Talmud is an explanation of Mishnah. But on the other hand, Talmud will bring us to a place that's even higher than Mishnah. But we're going to learn at length the mile of Gilui over Helam, and as well as the mile of Helam over Gilui. But we'll get to that next. So he goes on and says, Talmud gamchin b'chinas nihi, but it's a Chabad shebenihi. So when we talk about nihi, like Braisa, that's nihi of Zah. The nihi of Chabad, that's Mikra, only an outer expression of that etzem of Mikra. Here's the other way around. It's a lower level, but you're getting the Chabad of it. So because Talmud is calling Talmud is Taimi on Mishnah, so that's Chabad. You're understanding the reasoning behind the Mishnah. Chabad Shebenihi. And but what radiates is only a reflection. You're not getting an atzmi like you are in Mishnah, and definitely not like Mikra. Loi etzem ha'er. And he explained that the difference between Nigla and Nister. Now, you talk about Nigla the Teda, you get a revealed dimension that is relative to us. And he explains it's like Cyrus, that comes through the channels of thin strands like hair. So it's coming from Moichin, but what's being revealed is a very low level, like only Ha'ara. The Nister is the Moichin itself, but that remains concealed. And that's a Beira Cheshach. She'en meira er be'etzem l'havin sher shemaka chacham satela burya. The etzem er is not. You can't understand it in the purest form like you would in Mishnah. But, because that remains concealed. What we are getting is something that we can understand. So in other words, so Talmud is essentially being able to bring down the idea to a lower level of students. So he's understanding it. So it's nigla for him. But does he really get the depth of what the teacher is really understanding? No. Later we'll learn that through his process from the bottom up, he'll ultimately get even deeper, but that we're not there yet. Right now he's discussing it in the level of Gili. So Talmud is more explanatory and we can understand it, but it's not as quite as pure as the light of Mishnah, and definitely not as pure as the light of Mikra, which he's not talking about here right now. But it does come down in a way. So therefore, it's much more Chabad because we understand it. But what are we understanding? Something on our terms. Because the level of Mishnah itself, we're not on the full level to understand. That's the whole purpose of Talmud, is to bring down and explain the reasons of the Mishnah. Now he's going to explain this in detail in the next paragraph, exactly how this works. And the next paragraph is actually a little more, or a lot less abstract. And the levels, it explains it simply, what is Talmud in contrast to Mishnah? what is the exact role of each one of them. Because when we learn Gemara, most people don't see a difference between Mishnah and Gemara, except that Mishnah is short and Gemara is long. But they're not just a matter of short and long, they're actually two different levels of learning altogether. And we're going to understand that now. What is really the fundamental difference between Mishnah and Talmud? So that's a short summary of the entire picture, as well as bring it back to where we are right now. Now, just to make things, since again could be confusing, keep in mind that the concept of etzem and gilui is very vital here. When you say an etzem is not revealed, it doesn't mean that it's concealed. It means it's beyond revelation. So when you say etzem hanefesh, or your most intimate secrets within you that you can't even find words to express, liba lepuma legalia, like I've mentioned a number of times. There's certain things that are so deep and so profound in your life, you don't really they're not expressible. Like you say, I don't really have words to express my deepest feelings for something, or my deepest experiences. It's very intimate, very intense. So that's etzem. Gilui is the world of expression. Okay, so when you talk about mikra, you say mikra, you don't say it's concealed. You say mikra is an etzem, it's higher than revelation. So its only way of expression is through story form, through the facts, here are the mitzvahs, no details, no explanations. Mishnah's goal is to bring it into the world of Gilui. We want to understand it. We want to be able to relate to it. We want to be able to discuss it. That discussion is Mishnah and Braisa for a lower level, but basically that level. And that's why it's called Chagas. Now, there is a Chabad in it, obviously, because there's a discussion that you learn Mishnah with your Seichel, but primarily its goal is Gilui. So when you come now to the world of Talmud, what you're dealing now with is a person who's unable to derive everything from the Mishnah because it's either too condensed or too brief, or the Gilui is too high for him. So in a way, Talmud is where Braisa, Lefiyerach, the Mishnah, Talmud takes it to a whole other level, to levels of people who can't even take it out of the Braisa. So here you come, Talmud is therefore in the level of Giluyim, it's actually coming down to a much lower level. So it's less Gilui in a way, but it's more Gilui. It's more Gilui from the recipient's point of view. It's less Gilui because it's coming down to a recipient that's on a lower level. So ultimately, Talmud, because it comes down so low, will connect to the etzem. But that's what you have to keep in mind, that when you say something is concealed, not concealed, like Boira Cheshech, when he says Cheshech here, what does he mean by Cheshech? Does he mean Cheshech as in a lower level of a student? Or does he mean Cheshech in a like he said, that it's Lamaila Mebchinis Etzema Ershe B'Yitzirah. So this will become clearer later on. So for now, for all practical purposes, we have to see Talmud as a lower level of Gilui than Mishnah. However, it brings it down. It's like just like if you can teach a child, that means you're bringing the Gilui to a lower level, but there is Gilui because the child is able to understand it, or the beginner student, if you wish. So this is now what we're going to learn in what is the fundamental difference between Mishnah and Talmud, in their purpose, their function, and so on. It's not just two generations. That Mishnah was an earlier generation of greater scholars, the Tanoim, and Talmud is a lower generation of lesser scholars. That's also true, but it's a lot more than that, as we're going to learn now inside. So I'm ready to go continue, unless somebody wants to ask something about what I've said. A lot of what I've said will become clearer as we learn on, but I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any other points.
I have a question, Rabbi. In the sense of the way you're describing the way that it comes down in Talmud, isn't that sort of parallel to what you're saying about Mikra? That it comes from a higher level and goes in lower?
Not at all. It's exact opposite, actually.
Oh, it's the opposite. Okay. All right.
Because Mikra is coming straight from God to us, but it's such an intense level that all it could do is express itself through story form, through actions, through Asiya. Talmud is coming from us. We're trying to understand what it says in the Mishnah as it explains the Mikra. We're taking something and we're saying we don't really understand it. Let's try to figure it out. Now, that process of our effort can lead to deep levels, and it will lead to deep levels, but it's exactly opposite direction.
I see. I see. I guess what I was saying was that you can get to that deep level by that
But we
process.
haven't learned that. I just mentioned, I gave a preview of some of the things we're going to be learning. At this point, Talmud is the least amount of, it's like, Mishna is closer to Mikra than Talmud is. Because Talmud is
Yes.
our effort of trying to understand what we're being told.
Mm-hmm. But when you were talking about the Giluyim and
So I said I
then,
gave a preview of
all
pages
right, all
later.
right. I'm sorry.
You're
All
asking
right.
me about what I said. So we'll get there when we get there. Right now,
Okay.
Talmud is simply the process of us trying to understand something that's not clear. We're going to learn it inside right now.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a quick follow-up. This inyan of Mikra being Atzmi, and the reason why we only see, a certain portion of the Begilui is because it's an Atzmi. My question is, in Kabbalistic terms, when you say something is Atzmi, does that mean that the kalim are too small to contain all the light? So if you make just whatever, like an app, I don't know, a waterfall, gushing
No, that's not
waterfall.
the case. That's not the
No,
case.
not
You've
at all.
asked this number a number of times.
I keep trying. I'm trying to wrap my head around
It's
it.
simply not correct. That's the thing. It's not has nothing to do
I'm
with
not arguing
Kalim.
with you. I'm trying to understand it.
No, I understand. I'm just saying that's not the case. It means because it's higher than Gilui, it doesn't have a way of expressing. Let's just go. I just recommend that you go back to the words that he uses. He said, so therefore, it's coming from a level of divine that's higher than comprehension. So it's only more form is to tell a story, or it's to tell you the end statement, the result that this
is it Lamaila Mitam Etzem
doesn't use that word. He uses he uses the word Lamaila Mahasaga. I like to use the word that he used. Lamaila Mahasaga is the word.
Where did you see that?
The bottom of page 1365. Where he starts
sorry,
the whole topic.
I'm sorry,
and then
I
on
keep bringing it up.
1366, more in more, and then on the bottom of 1365, and then on top of 1366, he goes into more detail.
Okay. By the way, I'm not trying. Just to be clear, I'm not trying to be argumentative. I'm just trying to
I don't think
understand
you are, but I'm saying you should know that you are asking the same question. That's
over
all.
and over. I know. Clearly,
So
I
it means
haven't
to
gotten
me
it yet.
so I'm telling you, the only thing I can suggest is go back to read it, and without preconceived notion, and don't, that's
just
all I can
read
say.
what it says. Yeah. All right. Fair enough.
And then he says again, Shoshim b'chinas Chabad says, "Any yochel love bizgalus, lavdafke b'mokem hayeser nomoch."
I see it. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for interrupting.
It's a fundamental concept in general that an etzem does not reveal itself in the world of Giluyim. He explains it at length on 1366. Giluyim is Eris and Kalim. Etzem does not relate to Eris and Kalim. Like I gave the example of speech. You cannot express certain things that are in the deepest part of your heart. Not because the Kalim of the student are too weak, because it's beyond expression. It's an atzmi. It's not expressible. Some expression is only a very limited form of, like I mentioned many times, consciousness, awareness, gilui. These are all structural parameters. That itself is a limit. Atzmi is beyond that. Atzmi is not defined by structures. So the concept of more kalim, less kalim is only in the world of structures. So it's like you say that Tzimtzum does not affect the etzem, because Tzimtzum only affects where there's Gilui and Helam. You can only conceal something that relates to concealment and revelation. Something that's not subject to revelation is not subject to concealment.
Understood. Thank you. That was particularly helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so now he's going to explain in, I could say even in practical Balbatisha terms, what is the difference between Talmud and Mishna? So he says like this now. The bottom paragraph on page 1372, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along. So he says like this. V'hinei ha-Talmud hu pirush habir ha-Mishna. What is the Talmud? It's an interpretation, explanation, I should say, Pirush, interpretation and explanation of the Mishnah. As you see, if anyone, you learn Mishnah and Talmud, you see, you take a Mishnah, and then you start learning the Talmud. The Talmud will take a line from the Mishnah and start analyzing it. What does it mean? What does the Mishnah mean? And also explain the reasons for it. Litein tam ha-mishnayis, in order to give a reason for the ideas that are shared, that are stated in the Mishnayis. Lahavin ha-mishnayis, so that's litein tam. To understand the Mishnayis ha-seisirim zu as zu, the Talmud will also bring Mishnayis that contradict one another. Limse tam lifter ulecheva. And the Talmud looks for the reasons to either make it potter, that a person is absolved, or lecheva, or responsible. Le'isr uleheter. Another way that the reason why it's prohibited or it's permissible. So the Mishnah will make these statements. The Talmud will come and explain it, give reasons, understand contradictory Mishnayos, and find reasons. Either is it potter or is it chayiv, isur or heter. And this is a quote straight from Rashi Chagiga, Daf Yud Amud Aleph. So this is the Rebbe Rashab's not own words. He's quoting Rashi in the Masechta Chagiga 10a. Daf Yud Amud Aleph. Okay. Now he explains for who and what does it entail. So what does the Talmud do? How does it do this? What's the process? So it says v'hu masha Amoraim shapilpula Amoraim, that the Amoraim discussed pilpuls. From the word pilpul means discussion. It means discussion. It means interaction. It also includes argument, but pilpul is not only argument. Pilpul is when you sit down and you start discussing something in detail. B'koyach atzman, with their own initiative, with their own power. B'koyach chachmosam, with the power of their intelligence. In other words, it's not something they received. They may have received some things, obviously, and we'll talk about that. But what are they doing when they're being mefalpul, when they take a Mishnah and they start discussing it? They're using their b'koyach atzman, their effort, their initiative, their strength, their intelligence, lahavin taimei halacha sheba Mishnah, to understand the reasons for the laws in the Mishnah, ulataret se'inyanim haseisirim, and to answer and reconcile the things that seem contradictory, bekama kushis v'tirutzim, with a number of questions and answers. So there was question and answer discussion. Lahavin taimei halacha bekama kushis ad shehimidu hadover al buryeh, until they clarify it properly. So in other words, that's why it's Beida Cheshach, as we're going to learn. They're starting in a state of Cheshach, because it's not clear. If it was clear, they wouldn't have to do all of this. The reason they're doing it is because it's not clear. So therefore they discuss, which means the Eibishter invited the human being, the scholars, to use their minds to understand what he wants. Remember, we discussed, why didn't the Eibishter give it to us on a silver platter? Or a golden platter, for that matter. Because he wants us to integrate. This is all about interfacing. It's not just about learning and following orders. It's about understanding it and appreciating and asking questions and getting to the bottom of it. Al-Buryeh. Kumoi, and he gives an example, like it says in the Gemara, you'll have often the expression, Hocha b'mayaskina, where one Ameda will say, and here, what is he talking about? What is the Ameda saying? He's trying to distinguish two different places. Let's say one Mishnah says so, another Mishnah contradicts it. So say, Hacha b'mayaskina, because they're talking about two different scenarios. This Mishnah is talking in a time where so-and-so happened. This Mishnah, like if you find an object in the street, and one place it says you can take it if it doesn't have a siman, has no sign. Another place you can't. Seems like a contradiction. So the Mishnah will say, the Gemara will say, Ameda will say, because he was not miyayish. The person who lost it did not give up on it. And in this case, he did give up. So in other words, the Mishnah didn't spell it out. Those that learned Mishnah understood that. But the Gemara was not clear, so the Amoraim clarified. Why is there a distinction? I just gave one example. is talking about particular conditions. And that's how we make distinctions between one law and another law. We say, in that circumstance, it's like that. Another circumstance is a different circumstance. Another learning, another Amoraic, another Talmudic lesson is when there's something was missing, like a missing word or a missing lesson. So the Mishnah said something, but we were not aware of some detail. And the Gemara fills that in through the discussions again of the Amoraim. Just using a few Talmudic so-called logical methodologies of how. I just wanted to see if I could find an example of that. Surah Mechsera in the Gemara. Okay, let me just see. Okay, I'll look later. I don't want to take up everyone's time, but just curious.
What does it mean, Chasuri Machsara?
It means basically that the Talmud, just a second, just 1 second. That means that the Mishnah wrote something, but like in brief. It didn't write out all the details. So Chasuri Mechsera means it's missing a line, let's say. Not missing as a typo. It's just that the Tana, when he said it, he didn't spell it out all the way. So the Amoraim will clarify and say what he meant to say, and they'll add. It's like a witness makes a statement, and then you clarify what that statement was because they didn't spell it out entirely. That's why I'm looking for an example.
Well,
so essentially,
I found
it's
an
like
example.
adding words that are missing in the Mishnah itself.
I'll post on the thread. I found an example. Literally says it's Chasuri Mechsera. So it's
Okay,
in
there you go. Exactly. Yeah, that's
in Sukkot.
It's many places.
Yeah, I'll post one.
Okay, fine, good. Point being, what he wants to point out is that the Mishnah said it, but the Amoraim, when they started delving deeper into it, found contradiction or found something unclear. So they clarified it by either saying the conditions are different, or mechsed. V'chitzu kama dinim b'teich pilpulam b'keich chachmasam v'daitam. So not just they clarified things, they actually innovated a number of laws. From within this discussion, you can imagine new laws emerged. And where did it come from? It didn't come from the Mishnah directly. Maybe it's alluded to, but it came from their intelligence, through their intelligent effort, through their methodical approach. So now the Rebbe Rashab qualifies. What we said earlier, he's going back to a line he said all the way back on top of page 1365. He said, Umasha Kosa b'Priya Etz Chaim. Remember in Priya Etz Chaim he said that Talmud is in Bria. So there it said the hadinim shebetalmud hem b'chlal Mishnah. You're telling me now these dinim that came out through the Amoraim, through their effort, through their exerting themselves, through their process, that's a chiddush of Talmud. He says, in Priya Etz Chaim, it says the dinim in Talmud are considered part of Mishnah. So the Rebbe Rashab qualifies and says, Tzorich leimer shezeh mashabah lehem b'Kabbalah. That what it says in Priya Etz Chaim is talking about halachas, dinim that they receive b'Kabbalah. Not that they just figured out from their own logic. They receive b'Kabbalah. So Bottom line is, remember, these are students of Tanoim. So they're sitting and discussing something. Someone says, 1 second, it says here like this, it says here like that. And through their process, they come say, oh, so based on that, we derive a new din. Because the Mishnah just spoke in general. And now, through our discussion, we come away with a new din. So what is that new din? There's 2 ways you can understand it. The new din, one of the Amoraim will say, I actually heard from my teacher, so-and-so. So they heard this halachas b'Kabbalah. And that's B'chlal Mishnah. Because they actually heard it, they received it. It didn't come purely from it wasn't purely a logical derivative. Like it says in Priyetz Chaim, next page, 1373, that we're talking here things that are not an explanation of the Mishnah. We're not talking about an explanation, we're talking about something that they actually received. But something that they came away with, they did not receive from their teachers. It was niskadish, was innovated through their discussion. Talmud. That's in the category of Talmud. So in other words, in Talmud itself, the halachas in Talmud, there are 2 categories. There are those things that the Amoraim said that they heard and received, even though it doesn't say it in the Mishnah, but the Amoraim reveal it when they discuss it, or it came from their pilpul. And that's what he said earlier, so on the top there I mentioned, he said clearly that the Talmud is Pirush HaMishnayos V'Amasa Matan Pilim. The dinim that are not an explanation of the Mishnah, that's B'chlal Mishnah. In other words, there are things that are B'chlal Mishnah, and there are things B'chlal Talmud. Okay, that's just a qualification just to make the full picture here. So, now, firstly, if there are any questions, and then we'll continue, and he's going to explain in even more detail, which should be very clear after he explains the next section, what exactly is going on here. So he says about Inyan.
Oh, sorry.
Yes?
I was just going to say, did you mean to say that they received the Kabbalah from their teachers?
Kabbalah
No.
means to receive. Kabbalah is not Kabbalah as your. Kabbalah means to receive.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Va'inyan. The inyan of this is the hine halacha sheba Mishnah sasid Rebbe. So now he's going to say. So 1 second. So there's a big distinction here. Mishnah means it's not coming from their koyach hachachma and their koyach atzmei of the Tanoim. Talmud is primarily coming from them. It's a very big distinction. So he's explaining now how it works. Because the halachas in Mishnah, that Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rebbe, is Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, sometimes just called Rebbe, the teacher, that he organized. He was the one that organized the Mishnah and put it into writing, the first one. Everything he wrote in Mishnah was not based on this, but based on their innovation. It was all mekubal ish mepi ish, which is a classic expression, a Maseda. They received it basically, what's the word? Teacher to student, ish mepi ish. From mouth to mouth, basically. From mouth to ear, I don't know, I don't remember the exact expression. But bottom line is, ish mepi ish. This was they received it exactly like this. This is how it was passed on. Ada Zugis, till the generation of the Zugis. The Zugis is like we learn in Pirkei Avos, Shmai V'Avtalyan, and others that were like Zugis are partners. They learned together, so they had partners, Chavrusas, like. Until V'Anshe Knesset Agdela, the men of the Great Assembly. So if you look in Pirkei Avos, you see the order. Let me just say it here, and then I'll explain it. Ad Yeshua mepi Moshe, all the way to Joshua from the mouth of Moshe himself. Shetera tzivalonu Moshe shekibel mepi Agvura. And Torah was commanded to Moshe, and he heard it straight from Hashem. So open up a Pirkei Avos. Opening, what does it say? Moshe kibel Torah Messina, umesara liyeshua, and he passed it on to Joshua. Yeshua l'skenim, and skenim l'nevim. Yeshua passed it on to the sages, and the sages to the prophets. Nevim la'anshe Knesset Agdela, to the men of the Great Assembly, and the Anshe Knesset Agdela continues. The last of them passed it on ultimately to the Zugis, The first few Mishnas in Pirkei Avos enumerates and lists. It's actually that order, starting from Moshe, what's being passed on, halachas. They didn't pass. We're not talking about Mikra now. Mikra is the written Torah. It was obviously passed on. It's exactly the written Torah everybody uses. But we're talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh, what he calls Mishnayos. So Mishnayos is essentially passed on generation to generation, orally, the oral tradition. V'hainu shenimser ba'al peh means it was passed on ba'al peh orally. Borur v'tzolul, clear and precise. Kol din v'halacha k'moshehu, every law and every edict, k'moshehu exactly as it is, bli nitzrach lezeh iyun upilpul klal, without any need of delving into it and any discussion. It was passed on very clearly. That's Mishnah. As we'll soon see when he gets back to Talmud, Talmud is not that way at all. Talmud, they do not understand it. It's not clear to them. That's why they discuss it. And through their discussions, they come to our new understandings or reconciling or the different approaches that we take here. But Mishnah basically is halachas as it was passed on. So now we have, not Mikra is a given. That was exactly what Hashem, every letter, but even Mishnah is essentially ish mipi ish in a form of total clarity. Now he's going to qualify it. But one second, don't we find in the Mishnah disagreements? V'agam shahoyu lehem droshes rabbis b'ksuvim. And though we find in the Mishnah also there are many droshes rabbis b'ksuvim. B'dinei hamidas shebetera hanidroshes b'yud gimel midas. So we find also, we don't just find that they're passing on things, we find that the Tanoim in the Mishnah also use the methodologies, the droshes rabbis, which is the different analysis of the verses, the dinei hamidas, shatera, and the droshes b'yud gimel midas. And they follow the laws of the methodologies that the Torah was given to us, 13 different methodologies. Kal v'chemer, gzeira shava, binyanav. In other words, it's not purely passing on, literally verbatim what was said. There's also, they're using their intelligence to process. And he brings a raya from Kal v'chemer, from Torah Shebiksav and Parsha Ba'aleischa. There he brings the Kal v'chemer by Miriam. What's the Kal v'chemer there? You have to look in the pasuk at the end of Ba'aleischa. Anyway, the pasuk brings a Kal v'chemer. What's a Kal v'chemer? That's a logical statement that says, if the case is in such a situation, how much more so in a harsher situation? Basically, you learn from a lenient situation to a harder one. I think in legal terminology, it's called a priori or something like that. I remember. I'm not sure if that's what it's called. But in Torah Shebiksav, there's a Kal v'chemer. He's trying to show that even in the written Torah, you have sometimes a logical statement. It's not just purely receiving laws as they are. So he's saying, so though that's the case, I'll look it up. I'll tell you. I forgot it. For some reason, it's slipping my mind what the pasuk says. Hakol hoye bebir gomer. Nevertheless, even as they made these different calculations, these different derivations or whatever the word is, that they analyzed through their learning, but it was all bebir gomer. It was totally clear, bli shum bilbul, without any confusion. The taruvis and taruvis are mixing in other ideas, ubli machlekas klal, and without any arguments at all. In other words, it's an oir that came straight, generation to generation, without any confusion, any darkness. Lefisha oir de chachmei law, because the light of the supernal chachma, heir b'chachma tatad b'teres shoasheh k'moy. It radiated in the Chachma Tata, the Eir of Chachmei Law, the supernal wisdom, which most likely is referring to Torah Shebiksav. But in general, the wisdom of God was so clear that it radiated in the lower wisdom of the oral Torah, like a light that shines and you can see it even in the distance. Ukadlokos ner mener, like a candle that lights another, that is lit from another candle. Sholayipul shini v'taruv is klal. That in it does not have any distortion or any deviation or change at all. One candle lighting another candle. That's how it went from Moshe all the way to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, to Rebbe, when he wrote the Mishna. So the Mishna is essentially a documentation of what was passed on. Yes, in many cases they use a logic and a methodology, but all that is with clarity, without any confusion. V'chein hoya, and so it went, ad Shammai v'Hillel, until the generation of Shammai and Hillel. They were from the later Zugis. They were students of Shmai v'Avtalion, who were students of the remaining Anshe Knesset Agdela, as the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says. There, by Shammai and Hillel, began the first machlekes. Shenechlaku rak b'miktzas dvarim. Shammai and Hillel, not Beis Shammai and Beis Shammai, not the school of Shammai and Hillel, but Shammai and Hillel themselves, they disagreed on a number of things. Few things, miktzas, a few matters. So in other words, this idea of clarity was there all the generations. That's what ultimately what Mishnah is. And then what happened after Shammai and Hillel, they started a few disagreements. And after Shammai and Hillel, Talmidehem, their students, Achareim, the students after them, Shenisraba HaMachlekes become a Dinei HaTeira. That's when disagreements began to increase in a number of laws of Torah, but nevertheless, Makol Mokim, even with that, and still their words were still ish mi pi'ish. They all received from those before them. She'll say, so where were the disagreements? So the explanation given often for this is because they both makabel two different approaches. That's also possible. So there was no machlekes, like for example, the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. I remember when the Rebbe spoke about, it says in Sfarim, we asked the questions, put on Rashi tefillin or Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. Tefillin was put on in every generation, so why should there be disagreement? Just look at what your father did, what your grandfather did. So the answer is because in the time of Moshe, you could do it both ways. There was no halacha yet to do it this way or that way. So it's very possible that Moshe put on tefillin like according to the Shita of Rashi, and Aaron, his brother, put on like Shita of Rabbeinu Tam. There's nothing wrong. There's a lot of things like that in Torah. Not everything is spelled out. You have to do it this way. You could do it in several ways. And that's what was Kabbalah Ish Mipi Ish. So some people received this way, some people received that way. Then there came a time where the rabbis wanted to make a consensus that everyone should do it a certain way. Different reasons for that. So that's when there was a machlekes. Shammai said, this is the way to do it. Hillel said, this is the way. And then the Talmidim, it started multiplying, increasing these differences, but it was still Kabbalah Ish Mipi Ish. Ukumay Hashleshim Dvarim is bringing a Gemara that says, like the 30 things, Shesholim Rabbi Elazar, Yud Beis Amrlei Shamaiti. They asked Rabbi Elazar, I think it's Rabbi Elazar, 30 things, and he said, 12 of them I heard. Yud Ches Amrlei Lo Shamaiti. 18 of them I did not hear. So in other words, clearly that there were things that they heard clearly from the previous generations. 18 I did not hear. U'k'may Amar Akavya ben Mahalel, like Akavya ben Mahalel said, there's another Tana. Ani shemaiti v'heim shamu. I heard like this, and they heard like that. So we see in both cases that there are things Rabbi Elazar heard, there are things he didn't hear, but someone else heard them. Not everybody heard all the halachas from the previous generations. Whatever they heard was very clear. But it could very well be that one person heard from his teacher something that another person didn't hear. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and what did Rabbeinu HaKadosh do? Then came Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the same as Rabbi before, Rabbi Yehuda Nossi. Kibul kol hashmuas. he received all that was heard from all the students. He listened, he went to and spoke to all of them. V'chol hadinim, and all the laws. V'chol ha'biyurim epirushim, sheshamim Moshe Rabbeinu. All the explanations and interpretations that they heard all the way from Moshe Rabbeinu. Shalom do kol bezdin shabachol der v'der, and that every bezdin, every essentially court of law in all the generations learned it as they received it from the previous generation, and he took it all, v'chiberes ha-mishnayis, and he compiled or composed the mishnayis, b'loshen ktsara u'brura, short and sweet, short and clear. And he didn't do this himself. Together with him, he employed the support and the help of harbe machachomim from many of the sages of his time. In other words, to make sure that it was all accurate. V'im kibiru v'livnu hadvarim, and though in that process Rabbeinu HaKodesh, together with the Chachamim, they clarified and crystallized many things, hadvarim, because they had to write it down, they had to crystallize what exactly it was. Nevertheless, they did so without their own input. It was all what they received, ish mepish. And that itself, they had to clarify. What did they exactly hear? Because remember, one of the reasons Torah Sheba'al Peh was written down is because they saw that it's being forgotten. But at that point, they didn't forget yet. So therefore, they clarified everything. It's like sitting and comparing notes of everything we received from our previous generations all the way back to Moshe, clarifying it, but it was all Kabbalah ish mepi ish. Now he's going to qualify, what about the differences? What about their machlekas that they have between them? So I know I already explained the machlekas itself. You could say each one heard something different from their teacher. But he's going to explain a little more in detail what that means. But I think I'm going to stop here because and let me stop here at least for questions. So basically, you see what he's doing here. He's giving us a very, very clear picture of the difference between Mishnah and Talmud. He didn't get back to Talmud yet, but we will understand from that Talmud is not like this. It's not Kabbalah ish mepi ish, because the Kabbalah ish mepi ish goes in the category of Mishnah. But Mishnah is becoming very clear that Mishnah is in certain way like Mikra, not the Atzmi of Mikra, but the fact that it's coming straight from above, meaning straight from a Piyah Gvura, from Moshe to Yeshua, to us, to the Tanoim. It's much more Mamayla Lamata thing, and Talmud we'll see is more Mata Lamayla, in contrast to that. Okay, any questions?
I was just going to ask about the writing down of it, Rabbi.
Yeah,
I know you clarified everything, but there are people who say, well, it was set when it wasn't supposed to be written down. Does that process actually change anything, I guess, intrinsically?
so the Gemara has a whole discussion about it. It says it's supposed to, that the words that were passed on orally were not meant to be written down. It was actually prohibited to be written down. But then the sages got together and they saw the destruction of the temple, either coming or came. They saw that the Jews are being dispersed. Remember, up to that point, that all the Jews lived together, either in the wilderness and then in Israel. First temple, second temple. 70 years in between, but mostly together. So there was a certain preservation of the integrity. It's like in the time of the shtetl. There was no assimilation 500 years ago. So the same idea here. Everything was centralized. There was a Sanhedrin. So there was a lot of quality control possible. They realized that once the Jews are being exiled by the Romans, and they would not come back so fast. And they knew that it was not going to be easy. They realized that Torah, all this oral Torah, once everyone's dispersed, how are you going to make sure you have quality control? It'll be lost because not everyone's going to remember. People are going to forget. And they already saw things being forgotten. So the sages came together and they brought a verse. The verse says, "Eis lasis laHashem heferu teiresecha," that there are times where Hashem says, in order to preserve godliness, you're allowed to abrogate the Torah. I know it's a controversial statement, but not everybody can do this. Only people who have Yiras Shamayim, not someone who comes and says, "Listen, I'm not in the mood of eating kosher, so you know what? I'm going to break the Torah." We're talking about people who struggled very hard with this, and they realized that to preserve the Torah, sometimes you have to break one law of the Torah, which was not to write it down. So they made the decision that if the Torah gets all forgotten, what will help us if we keep preserving that law that says don't write it down? The Torah will be forgotten and things will be a lot worse. So they made the decision. It was a very dramatic and controversial decision that we will allow the Torah to be written down, the oral Torah, in order to save the Torah. So it's like pikuach nefesh, if you wish, saving a life. Like it says sometimes you break Shabbos, one Shabbos, in order to keep many Shabbos. Anyway, this is a whole discussion. This is not taken lightly at all. This is long discussion in the Talmud about this, and commentaries upon commentaries that ask what other scenarios are you allowed to do that? Can you do that? Who can do that? Not simple. You can't just come and do that. You can't just say, hey, you know what? Let everybody start driving on Shabbos because they won't go to shul. There are reasons you can't apply that to that situation, and there are books about this. Not really the place to go into right here. It's not relevant, but the point is, it was a big. You have to keep in mind, we're talking about sages here that were not just brilliant people; they were also holy people.
Yeah,
they would never do anything just for their own self-interest. So they struggled with this, and this is something they came up with. They realized that we have to do this, and I'm sure that they had some type of sanction, some from heaven to do so. And that's where Torah Shabbat Peh became written down, and today we have it.
I think that your comparison to pikuach nefesh is a very, very apt one. That in order to save a life, you can,
Yeah, that was more or less that was the conclusion they came to, and they wrote it down. And look, bottom line is, had they not, what would have happened? Look, today you have 80-90% of the Jewish people don't know Torah altogether. Imagine what would have happened if they never wrote it down 2,000 years ago.
probably wouldn't be here anymore.
Exactly. So they realized that to keep it, this way we have a documentation, you have a Talmud, you could open it up. Not only that, I remember I once spoke at a legal conference in Brooklyn with the lawyers and so on, and I spoke about Torah Shabbat Peh. And a guy got up, who's not Jewish, an attorney, he says, we have to thank you for that you wrote down the oral Torah, because most of constitutional law is based on Talmudic laws.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It goes back to also what, I mean, this is a little bit of a stretch, but when Bibi said in the speech, we're talking about the fight between civilization and barbarism. I mean, this is where we derive all of our civilization, from Torah.
Yeah, this page that we're learning now, I would tell you all, mark it down, because it's a very fundamental understanding of Torah, Mishna, Talmud. It's and really, as you see here, is not Kabbalistic at all. This is very practical. He spells out exactly how it was all developed. You'll soon see how he goes back to Talmud. I think we're going to stop here. Are there any other questions? And getting back to just the central theme, keep in mind that this is purely, you see now, how Torah itself, Mikra, that's why I gave the introduction. Then there's Mishna, which brings it, passes on and explains the Torah's halachas, the written Torah's halachas laws. But we're going to get to now what happens after Mishnah, when things started darkening, and was not Me'ish Me'ish anymore, and they did not understand everything that says in the Mishnah. That's what we're going to learn about. So we're coming away with this, ultimately getting back to interface how Torah remains Torah even when we're going to deal with Cheshach. So meanwhile, now we're still talking about till the time of the Second Temple, the end of the Second Temple, beginning of the Golus, that we still have that clarity. But then there's stages where you lose that clarity. So I find that fascinating also. In general, you want to know how things evolve from a clear state to when did we lose some of that clarity? That's what he's going to be discussing, obviously, as we go along here. So the concept of an interface of Torah helping us find in the dark. Remember, Eir Hariyah, we can't see with our own eyes in the dark. We need a light from outside. So this is the discussion. What does that light look like? So we know the light of Mikra. We know the light of Mishna. We're learning now the clarity of Mishna. We'll soon learn about the light of Talmud. And then we're going to bring it back to ultimately a neshama of how we grow through all of this and ultimately are able to see with our own eyes. So we'll get there. So we'll stop here, middle of page 1373. Unless there are any other questions, I'll stop here.